I sold my land, emptied every dollar I had saved, and quietly stopped buying my wife's medication to cover the gap, all to keep my son's life from falling apart. Then one day, my planer broke down, and I couldn't send the money on time. He called and said, "You had me so you could have someone to take care of you when you got old." The line went dead. I stood alone in my dark workshop, and something in my chest broke quietly. But what happened next, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. Before this story goes any further, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country below those comments. Remind me why I keep telling these stories. You're home at Wise Revenge. Certain details in this story were created to serve the telling. The characters and places are fictional, what they leave behind in you is not. The can of paint has been sitting on the porch railing since yesterday morning. Sky blue. The label says, Curious Sky, which is the kind of name a paint company gives a color when they want you to feel something before you even open the lid. I bought it at the hardware store in Ankeny, same place I've bought every can for the past 36 years. The man behind the counter didn't ask what it was for. He knows. Everybody in this town knows about the blue door on the Miller place. I'm 62 years old. I've been a furniture carpenter for 38 of those years, which means I've held more tools than I can count and built more things than I'll ever remember. My hands know what to do with a brush. They've known since I was 19, and my father handed me a roller and told me to stop thinking so hard about it. This morning, my hands don't know what to do. I'm standing on the front porch of our farmhouse in Ankeny, Iowa, with a paintbrush in my right hand, and that unopened can at my feet. And the door in front of me is the same door. It's always been wood frame, brass handle, worn smooth in the middle from 40 years of palms pushing through it. Except the blue has faded to something closer to gray at the edges, and there's a crack running along the bottom panel I've been meaning to fill since last spring. From inside the house, I can hear Martha in the kitchen. The particular rhythm of her moving around in their coffee cup on the counter, the soft thud of the oven door, the way she hums without knowing she's doing it when she's making something that takes concentration. She's been up since 4:30. I've been up since 4. We've been married 38 years, and we still haven't figured out how to sleep past sunrise. Down the hall in the room that used to have baseball pennants on the wall, and now just has the indentations where the nails were. My son Ethan is asleep. He's 28 years old, and he's been back in that room for 6 weeks now, since the surgery at University of Iowa hospitals went well enough that the doctors said he could stop counting his own heartbeats every hour. 6 weeks of slow mornings and longer afternoons, and the particular silence of a man learning to breathe without pain. Caleb Johnson is coming at noon. He'll pull his truck up the gravel drive the way he's been doing since he and Ethan were 10 years old, and he'll walk straight into the kitchen without knocking, because that's what Caleb does. And Martha will have already put coffee on for him, even though she claims she forgets every time. Caleb drove down from Iowa City the night before Ethan's surgery and sat in a plastic hospital chair for 4 hours and 35 minutes without complaining once. That's the kind of man Caleb Johnson is. I should open the paint. Yesterday evening, Ethan came out to the workshop while I was finishing a side table for a client in Des Moines. He stood in the doorway the way he used to as a little kid, hands in his pockets, watching me work. I let him stand there. After a while, he said, "Dad, you think we could repaint the front door together? When you're ready." When you're ready. 3 words. I put down my sanding block and looked at my son standing in the doorway of my workshop, and I understood that he wasn't just asking about the door. He was asking something harder than that. Something that deserved a real answer. Not the kind a man gives when he's still in the middle of sorting through a thing. I told him I'd think about it. He nodded and went back inside. And I stood in that workshop for a long time after the light changed, looking at the small chair I made years ago from a piece of wood I kept when I sold the East Field. The East Field was my father's land. 12 acres of the best topsoil in Polk County, and I sold it the year Ethan got into Cornell University because that's what the math required. I kept one board from the old storage shed on that property, made it into a chair, set it in the corner of my workshop. I never told Ethan about the land. I told him we worked it out, and he believed me because he was 18 and excited, and I wanted him to stay that way. That chair has been sitting in the corner of my workshop for 6 years. Nobody sits in it. The blue door. Martha painted it the first week we moved into this house back in 1989. We had almost nothing then, a mattress on the floor, 2 boxes of dishes, and enough stubbornness to make up the difference. A neighbor named Roy Hendricks brought over a can of leftover paint from a job he'd finished, and Martha looked at that blue and said it was perfect. "Paint it blue, Arthur," she told me. "A blue door means the people inside are going to be okay." I painted it that afternoon. I've repainted it every 5 years since, no matter what. The year the furnace broke in January, and we heated the whole house with the kitchen stove. The year the corn came in at half yield, and I took every cabinet job I could find in a 3-county radius just to cover the property tax. I painted it those years too because Martha said it meant something, and I've learned that when Martha says something means something, you'd do well to believe her. There's 1 year I haven't painted it yet. These past 2 years, to be exact. 14 months ago, my son called me on a Tuesday night at 10:45 while I was alone in the workshop finishing a contract piece. He said something to me during that phone call that I have carried in my chest every single morning since. I haven't told Martha what he said. I haven't told Caleb. I'm not sure I've even let myself say it out loud, the way you sometimes leave a splinter alone, because you know pulling it out is going to hurt worse than just leaving it be. But yesterday evening, standing in that workshop doorway, Ethan asked me when I'd be ready. And I think the honest answer is that I can't be ready until I've told this story from the beginning. Until I've said out loud what I know and what I didn't know, and what I kept quiet when I should have spoken, and what I said when I should have kept quiet instead. It starts with a piece of land my father loved. It starts with a boy who made us proud, and a system that ran itself for 15 months without anyone asking the right questions. It starts, if I'm being exact about it, with an envelope in a mailbox and a number on a slip of paper, and me standing right here in almost this exact spot reading it twice before I understood what it was asking me to become. I pick up the paintbrush. I look at the door. Not yet. First, the story. The email came on a Thursday morning in September, 6 years ago. I was in the workshop sanding the legs of a dining table for a client up in Minneapolis, and my phone buzzed on the workbench. I picked it up with sawdust still on my fingers and read the subject line 3 times before I set the sander down. "Congratulations on your admission to Cornell University." I stood in that workshop for a long time without moving. The sander was still running. I turned it off, read the email again. Then I walked into the house and found Martha at the kitchen table paying bills, and I set the phone down in front of her without saying a word. She read it. Her hand went to her mouth. Then she looked up at me with those dark eyes that have never once in 38 years told me anything other than exactly what she was thinking. "He did it," she said. "He did it," I said. We stood there in that kitchen grinning at each other like 2 people who had just been told the best news of their lives, because that is exactly what it was. That evening, after Ethan called from his college dorm room in Iowa City, hollering so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, Martha and I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and did the math. Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Tuition room board fees, the whole number came to roughly $55,000 a year. 4 years. $220,000 give or take. We looked at that number for a while. I had the workshop bringing in between 65 and 70,000 a year, depending on contracts. Good money for Uncanny, Iowa. Not Cornell money. Not without help. The East Field, Martha said. She didn't ask it as a question. The East Field was 12 acres my father farmed for 40 years before his knees gave out. Best topsoil in Polk County, he used to say, and he wasn't wrong. When he passed, he left it to me with a handwritten note tucked inside the deed that said simply, "Keep it in the family if you can, Arthur. But don't let pride cost your children their future." My father was a practical man. He understood that land is worth what it can do for the people who love it. I called a realtor the next morning. The East Field sold for $180,000. I borrowed an additional $40,000 from the Ankeny Community Credit Union at 4.2% interest over 7 years. Together, it covered Cornell. I never told Ethan where the money came from. When he asked, I said we worked it out, and I said it in the tone I use when a conversation is finished. He was 18 years old, and the whole world was opening up in front of him, and I did not want him to carry the weight of that land into his first semester. My father's note said, "Don't let pride cost your children their future." It didn't say anything about letting them know the price. Before I signed the papers on the East Field, I went out there one last time on a Tuesday afternoon in October when the corn had already been harvested and the ground was bare. I walked the fence line the way my father used to slow hands in my pockets. There was an old storage shed on the north corner, the wood gray and soft, with age, the door hanging on one hinge. I went inside. It smelled like oil and turned earth and something else. I don't have a name for the particular smell of a place where a man has worked his whole life. I pulled one board from the wall. Straight-grained oak, 8 inches wide, still solid despite the years. I took it home and made a small chair. Nothing fancy. Just a chair, the kind you make when your hands need to be doing something and your head needs to be somewhere quiet. I put it in the corner of the workshop and left it there. That chair is still there. Nobody has ever sat in it. The day I finalized the sale, Caleb Johnson drove out to the property line and stood there while the realtor's car pulled away. Caleb had been Ethan's best friend since the 3rd grade, the kind of friendship that starts over a shared lunch table and somehow survives everything after that. He'd grown up 2 farms over gone to Iowa State for a construction trades program and was already building a solid reputation as a contractor in Iowa City. He wasn't a man who made speeches or said things for effect. He looked at me when the car was gone and stuck out his hand. "He better make it worth it, Mr. Miller," Caleb said. I shook his hand. "He will," I said. 4 years. Ethan came home every summer, called every Sunday without being reminded, told me about his finance courses, his professors, a professor named Dr. Holt, who had worked on Wall Street for 20 years before deciding he'd rather teach. I listened to every word of it. Those Sunday calls were the best part of my week for 4 years running, and I am not ashamed to say so. The spring, Ethan turned 22, he graduated. He called that evening from a party somewhere, voice hoarse from celebrating, and told me he had already accepted a position at a firm called Apex Capital Management in Midtown Manhattan, starting salary $95,000 a year. I was standing in the workshop when he told me. I looked at the small oak chair in the corner and I thought, there it is. That's what the East Field was for. 3 weeks later, Ethan called again. Different tone this time, careful, like a man carrying something he didn't want to drop. He said he had met someone. Her name was Jessica. The way he said her name, slow, like he was tasting it, made me smile without meaning to. I told him to bring her home sometime. He said he would. That summer, he did. They stayed 2 hours for lunch, and Jessica sat across from Martha at our kitchen table and answered every question Martha asked, with a smile that started a half-second after the question ended. Not rude, just measured. like a woman who had learned to be careful about what she let people see. Martha noticed. I noticed Martha noticing. When they left, Ethan hugged me in the driveway the way he always had, arms all the way around, solid, the hug of a boy who was raised to mean it. Jessica stood by the passenger door and smiled and said it was lovely to meet us. I watched their car go down the gravel road and turn onto the county highway. Martha came and stood beside me. "She's smart," Martha said. "She is," I agreed. She looked at the workshop the way people look at something they're trying to decide how to feel about. Martha said. I didn't answer that. We went inside. Martha started on the dishes, and I went back to the workshop, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, because there was nothing useful in saying it yet. 6 months later, a wedding invitation arrived in the mailbox. The Plaza Hotel, New York City. January 14th. I had never heard of a reception at the Plaza Hotel. I looked it up that evening on my laptop. I read the room rates and closed the laptop and went to bed. The suit cost $45 to rent from a Men's Warehouse in Des Moines, and the man who fitted it told me I looked sharp. I thanked him and didn't tell him I'd be returning it Monday morning. Martha bought a dress from a department store, blue with small white flowers, the kind of dress that looks like it was made for a Sunday in June rather than a January wedding in New York City. She ironed it twice the night before we left and hung it on the back of the bathroom door so it wouldn't wrinkle on the bus. We took a Greyhound from Des Moines to Port Authority. 22 hours. Martha slept most of the way with her head against my shoulder, and I watched the country change outside the window, flat Iowa giving way to the hills of Pennsylvania. Then the strange compression of everything as we came into New Jersey, and the skyline appeared across the water like something from a movie neither of us had seen. "Arthur," Martha said when she woke up and looked out the window. "I know," I said. That was the whole conversation. The Plaza Hotel sits at the corner of 5th Avenue and Central Park South, and standing in front of it in my rented suit, with Martha's hand in mine, I understood for the first time, in a concrete way, what the room rates I'd read on my laptop actually meant. The building is 17 stories of French Renaissance limestone, and the doormen wear uniforms that cost more than my suit rental. A woman walked past us with a dog in a bag. The dog had a sweater on. Martha squeezed my hand. "We clean up okay, Arthur," she said. I wanted to believe her. I tried to. Inside the wedding was everything the building promised it would be. White flowers I couldn't name arranged in columns along the ballroom entrance. A string quartet playing something classical near the bar. 200 guests who moved through the room with the easy confidence of people who had attended many rooms exactly like this one. Jessica's family occupied the front tables. Her father, a man named Richard Thorne, was a corporate attorney from Pasadena, California. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of man whose handshake tells you immediately that he knows exactly how firm to make it. Her mother, Linda, had remarried a real estate developer named Warren and wore jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. They were both perfectly pleasant to us. They asked where we were from. They nodded when we said Iowa. They moved on. Ethan looked happy. That was the thing I kept coming back to all evening, my son standing at the front of that ballroom in a tuxedo that fit him, like it was built for him, specifically laughing at something. A groomsman said, touching Jessica's hand when she walked past. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been trying to get to for a long time. Martha and I sat at a table near the back of the room. Table 11, which is not an unlucky number, but is also not table 1. Caleb sat with us. He'd driven up from Iowa City because Ethan had asked him to be there, and Caleb Johnson does not say no to people he loves. He wore a dark blue suit that was his own, not rented, and he sat with his big contractor's hands folded on the tablecloth and watched the room the way a man watches something He's trying to understand. Hell of a party. Caleb said, for people who don't know each other. It's a wedding, I said. Sure, Caleb said. Still, Ethan came to our table once during the cocktail hour before the dinner service began. He hugged Martha and shook my hand and told us the food was going to be incredible, we'd love it. He smelled like a cologne I didn't recognize, and his eyes were bright and moving, taking in the whole room at once the way a man does when he wants to make sure everything is going right. He stayed 4 minutes. I counted because I had nothing else to count. Jessica wore a dress that probably had a name I didn't know. She was beautiful in it. When she came to the table to greet us, she kissed Martha on the cheek and told her she was so glad we could make it. The trip must have been exhausting. Martha said it wasn't bad at all. Jessica smiled and said she loved Martha's dress. Then her eyes moved past Martha's shoulder to something across the room, and she was already turning when she finished the sentence. Martha watched her go. Her face didn't change at all, which is how I know something registered. It was Caleb who saw it. We were midway through the dinner service salmon for the fish course, something with beef after when Caleb leaned toward me slightly and said low enough that only I could hear, "You see that?" I followed his eyes. Ethan and Jessica were standing near the head table, Jessica speaking close to Ethan's ear. Ethan glanced toward our table, toward table 11, toward the rented suit and the flower dress, and the 2 people from Iowa who had taken a Greyhound 22 hours to be here. Then he leaned down and said something back to Jessica. Jessica's shoulders dropped about half an inch the way a person's do when they've been told something reassuring. "What did he say?" I asked. I couldn't hear it," Caleb said, but his jaw was tight in a way I recognized from 30 years of knowing him. He'd heard enough. After the reception, Ethan and Jessica saw us to the lobby. Ethan hugged me the way he always had, both arms, solid, the real kind. Jessica thanked us for coming. The doorman got us a cab to Port Authority. In the cab, Martha looked out the window at the city going past. I looked at her profile. After a while, she said, "He didn't come back to the table after the dinner service." "No," I said. "He didn't." "He was busy," Martha said. "He was," I agreed. We didn't say anything more about it. The cab pulled up to Port Authority, and we got our bags and went inside to wait for the bus home, and I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and thought about my son's face when he glanced toward table 11. I thought about the half-inch drop in Jessica's shoulders. I thought about the 4 minutes. 2 weeks after we got home, I went to the mailbox on a Tuesday morning and found an envelope. My name on the front in Ethan's handwriting. Inside a folded slip of paper. A number. A bank routing code. A note that said Dad would mean a lot. Just until we get settled. E. I stood at the mailbox and read it twice. Then I looked out at the east field, at the corn stubble on ground that used to be my father's, now belonging to a man named Gerald Foss, who ran 400 acres and a soybean operation and had never once spoken to me about anything other than crop prices. I folded the slip of paper, put it in my shirt pocket, walked back inside. I called Ethan the day after the envelope arrived. He picked up on the second ring, and before I could say anything beyond his name, he launched into an explanation that had clearly been prepared in advance. The apartment on the Upper East Side ran $4,500 a month, he said. That was just rent, not utilities, not the parking spot Jessica needed for her car. Not the costs that came with maintaining appearances in a world where appearances had professional consequences. Jessica worked in marketing for a fashion company in Midtown, and the people she worked with, the clients she needed to impress, they noticed things. The neighborhood you lived in, the restaurant you suggested for lunch, the address on your business card. "I'm not asking forever, Dad," he said. "Just until the bonus cycle hits in March. Just to bridge the gap." I was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the workshop. The light was on in there because I'd been working before the call, and through the window I could see the edge of the oak chair in the corner, just the arm of it catching the light. "How much?" I said. "$2,500 would help enormously," he said. "If you can manage it?" I told him I'd see what I could do. We hung up. I stood at that window for a while longer. Then I went to the desk in the bedroom, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a hardcover notebook I'd had for years, the kind with a sewn binding that doesn't crack when you open it flat. I wrote the date at the top of the first page. Below it I wrote February 2024, 2,500 ohms. I transferred the money that afternoon. The March bonus Ethan mentioned did not result in a phone call. In April, a second envelope arrived. Same handwriting, same format. The number inside was $3,000 this time, with a note on the back that said the bonus had been smaller than expected and April rents were due. I opened the notebook and wrote April 2024, $3,000. Bonus insufficient per Ethan. I called him that month and asked directly where the money was going, not as an accusation, as a question. I said I wanted to understand the situation so I could help in a way that made sense. Ethan said the cost of living in New York was genuinely difficult to explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. He said Jessica's parents had certain expectations about how their daughter lived, and those expectations had professional and social dimensions he was still navigating. He said he appreciated my concern, and he'd have a clearer picture by summer. I wrote in the notebook, called to ask. Answered with context, not specifics. Then I closed the notebook and did not call again to ask. That was my mistake, and I have owned it every day since. The system ran itself after that. An envelope arrived. I transferred the amount I recorded it in the notebook. The envelopes came with decreasing explanation, and I stopped requiring one. 2,500. 3,000. 2,800. Because Jessica's dental work wasn't fully covered by insurance, and the out-of-pocket was significant. 3,200 in October because the building assessed a maintenance fee and Ethan hadn't budgeted for it. To fund it, I did the following things which I recorded in the notebook alongside each transfer. I took every additional carpentry contract I could find within a 3-county radius. The workshop light was on until 11 o'clock most nights. Our neighbors, the Pattersons, asked Martha once if everything was okay, because they could see the light from their bedroom window. Martha told them I was working on a big project. That was true in a sense. I sold a hydraulic wood splitter I'd owned for 12 years, $4,200, to a man in Ames who paid cash and drove it away on a flatbed trailer. I sold a backup planer I'd kept for overflow work, another $4,200. I withdrew $29,000 from my individual retirement account 14 months ahead of schedule. Under IRS rules, early withdrawal from a traditional IRA before age 59.5 triggers a 10% penalty on the full amount, which meant I lost $2,900 the moment I made that decision. I made it anyway. I wrote in the notebook IRA withdrawal $29,000. Penalty paid $2,900. I pulled $14,000 from the harvest reserve money set aside each fall against a bad crop year or a broken piece of equipment. The kind of money a farmer keeps, because farming is the business of being ready for what you cannot predict. The notebook filled slowly. Every entry exact. Every source documented. It was in the 7th month that I drew a line through a different kind of entry. Martha's blood pressure medication ran $180 a month. She'd been on it for 3 years, managed carefully by Dr. Evans, keeping her numbers in a range that was safe and sustainable. That month, looking at the account, 4 days before the transfer was due, I did the arithmetic and drew a single line through the words, Martha medication, 180. I told myself it was 1 month, I told myself I'd catch it up in the fall when the Minneapolis contract paid out. I drew that same line 8 more times over the following months. 9 lines total. I did not tell Martha. Martha did not mention her prescription running out. We lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, ate at the same table, and neither of us said a word about it, because I was ashamed to have made the choice, and she was, I understand now, protecting me from knowing what my choice had cost her. One evening in February, about 14 months into the system, I went looking for a pair of scissors in Martha's nightstand drawer. I found the scissors. I also found a prescription bottle, new label, recent date, Dr. Evans' name printed across the top. Next to it, pushed to the back of the drawer, a second bottle. Same medication. Empty. The date on the empty bottle was 9 months earlier. I stood in the bedroom, holding both bottles for a long time. Then I put them back exactly where I found them, in the same position, and closed the drawer. I went out to the workshop. I picked up a chisel and set it down. Picked it up again. Set it down. Did that for a while. The oak chair sat in the corner of the workshop, same as always. I looked at it until I couldn't look at it anymore. Then I turned off the light and went back inside. Caleb told me what happened at Flannery's about a week after it happened, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee he never touched. He laid it out the way he lays out everything, straight, no decoration, watching my face the whole time to see where it landed. I'm going to tell it the way he told it to me. It was a Thursday evening in October, 14 months into the envelope system, and Caleb was at Flannery's bar on 46th Street in Hell's Kitchen with 2 guys from his construction crew after a long day pouring foundation on a commercial job in Midtown. They had a table near the back. Caleb had a beer he was making last. He wasn't in a social mood. He'd been on his feet since 6 in the morning, and his knees were talking to him the way they'd started doing that year. Then he heard a laugh from the table diagonal to his. He knew that laugh before he turned his head. He'd known it since the 3rd grade. Ethan was sitting with 3 men in suits, clients from the look of it, the kind of men who lean back in their chairs and let other people work to hold the conversation. Ethan was working. He had his jacket on, his posture straight, and he was telling a story with the easy confidence of a man who had learned that a room will follow you if you give it somewhere to go. The story was about the farm. My family's got land going back 3 generations, Caleb heard Ethan say. Hundreds of acres out in Iowa. My dad runs the whole operation, carpenter farmer, the real thing. Does well. Sends money every month like clockwork. Very comfortable situation back home. One of the men in suits said something Caleb couldn't make out. Ethan laughed and leaned forward and said, "No, genuinely, it's a good setup. Old-fashioned, but it works." Jessica was there too at the end of the table. When Ethan said the last part, she smiled and picked up her wine glass, and the men in suits nodded with the satisfied look of people who have just been given a fact that confirms something they already believed. Caleb said he sat with that for a moment. He described it to me as the feeling of reaching for something familiar and finding a different shape than you expected. He knew what the farm looked like. He knew what my workshop looked like at 11 o'clock at night. He knew what a 12-acre field looked like when it no longer belonged to the family whose name had been on the deed for 40 years. He finished his beer. He said goodbye to his crew. He walked outside and stood on 46th Street in the October wind. And he called up the image of my kitchen, the old table lamp, the television that was too small for the room, the pair of Martha's garden shoes by the back door that she'd resoled twice rather than replace. Then he bought a Greyhound ticket on his phone and rode it home to Iowa that weekend. He showed up Saturday afternoon. Martha answered the door, and her face did the thing it does when she sees someone she loves unexpectedly, a brightness that starts in her eyes before the rest of her face catches up. She told him to come in and asked if he'd eaten, and he said he was fine, and she made him a plate anyway, which is the only response Martha Miller has ever had to that particular statement. We sat down to supper. Caleb looked at the table: boiled potatoes, canned green beans, a small cut of pork shoulder that Martha had stretched into 3 servings with enough onion and seasoning to make it feel like more than it was. Simple food, honest food, the kind of meal that tells you exactly what a household has and doesn't have, without anyone saying a word. "This is real good, Mrs. Miller," Caleb said. "It's nothing special," Martha told him. "I didn't know you were coming. It's plenty," he said, and he meant it in more ways than one. After dinner, Martha stood to clear the plates. She reached across the table for the serving dish, and I watched her pause just for a second, her hand going to her sternum, pressing there lightly. Then she picked up the dish and carried it to the sink and turned the water on. Caleb looked at me. I looked at my hands. That was when Caleb decided. He told me so later, directly. Not when he heard Ethan at Flannery's, not on the bus ride home. It was that half-second at the dinner table, Martha's hand on her chest, that made up his mind. He waited until Martha had gone to the living room. Then he put both forearms on the table and looked at me across the supper dishes and told me everything. Flannery's, the suits, the story Ethan had told about the farm, the words, "very comfortable situation back home," delivered with a smile to men who would remember it. I listened without moving. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet, except for the television in the other room and the particular sound a refrigerator makes at night when the house has stopped humming around it. "Arthur," Caleb said, "say something." I looked at my hands on the table. The knuckles, the calluses at the base of each finger from 38 years of tools, the faint scar on my right thumb from a chisel slip in 1911 that Martha had bandaged with a dish towel because we were out of gauze. I turned my right hand over and looked at the palm. Then I closed it. "Thank you for coming," I said, "and for telling me." Caleb nodded. His jaw moved like he wanted to say more. Then he pressed his lips together and let it go. He left after 9. I walked him out to his truck in the dark. At the door of the cab, he stopped and turned and said, "What are you going to do?" I looked back at the house. The kitchen light on, the workshop dark, the front door at the end of this porch, the faded blue, the crack along the bottom panel. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to think on it." He got in the truck and drove down the gravel road, and I stood in the dark until his taillights turned onto the county highway and disappeared. I went back inside. Martha was in the living room with her show on. I sat down beside her. She leaned against my shoulder the way she always does. I put my arm around her. We sat like that until the show ended. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and thought about a bar in Hell's Kitchen, and a laugh I would have known anywhere, and a man who had told a room of strangers that everything back home was very comfortable. I thought about the notebook in the desk drawer, the 9 lines I'd drawn through Martha's name. I thought, how long does a man wait before he stops waiting? I bought the ticket on a Monday in early December without telling Martha. Greyhound round trip Des Moines to Port Authority, $187. I told Martha I was driving to Des Moines for machine parts, a planer belt I'd been putting off ordering. She was at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, going through a seed catalog, and she said okay, and told me to drive careful, because the forecast said freezing rain past Ames. I drove to Des Moines. I parked at the bus station. I boarded the bus with a duffel bag and a shoebox Martha had lined with wax paper and filled with cornbread the day before for no particular reason, the way she sometimes bakes when the weather turns cold and the house needs something warm in it. 22 hours. I watched Iowa become Illinois, become Indiana, become Ohio, become Pennsylvania, become New Jersey, and then the tunnel, and then New York. I hadn't called ahead. That was the point. I wanted to see the apartment, See how Ethan was living, see for myself what $4,500 a month looked like from the inside. Not to confront him, just to know. A father is allowed to want to know. I took the subway uptown from Port Authority, the one train to 79th Street, then walked east. The Upper East Side in December is the kind of beautiful that doesn't notice you looking at it. Clean sidewalks, dressed windows, Christmas wreaths on the doors of brownstones that cost more than I'd earn in 20 years. I walked with the shoebox under my arm and found the building on the third block. 14 stories. A doorman in a gray coat who nodded at me when I stopped at the entrance. I called Ethan from the sidewalk. He picked up on the third ring. I could hear music in the background. Something with a bass line voices the particular blur of a room that has too many people in it. Dad. His voice went careful the way it does when a situation requires managing. Why did you call ahead? I'm downstairs, I said. Thought I'd surprise you. A pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough? Dad, there are people here right now. It's not the best. He stopped. Started again. This isn't really a good time. I looked up at the building. 14 floors of lit windows against the December sky. That's all right, I said. I was just passing through. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. We'll set something up properly. Okay. Sure, I said. You enjoy your evening. I hung up. I stood on that sidewalk for 20 minutes. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. Maybe for the door to open anyway. Maybe for the phone to ring back. Neither happened. People moved around me in both directions, purposeful and warm in their coats, and I stood there with a shoebox of cornbread until the cold worked its way through my jacket, and I understood that I was done standing there. I walked back to the subway, took the 1 train back downtown, came up out of the ground at 50th Street, and walked the 2 blocks to Port Authority. The bus back to Des Moines didn't leave until 11:15. I had 4 hours. I found a row of plastic chairs under fluorescent lights on the 2nd level and sat down. A man was sleeping 2 seats over with a paper cup wedged between his thigh and the armrest. I set the shoebox on the empty seat beside me. After a while, the man woke up and looked at the shoebox and looked at me. Cornbread, I said. He nodded like that was a reasonable thing to find in a bus station at 8 in the evening. You want some? I asked. He said he wouldn't say no. I opened the box and we each had a piece. And he told me his name was Curtis and he was waiting on a cousin who was coming in from Philadelphia. I told him I was heading back to Iowa. He said he'd been to Iowa once, Kansas City area, which is not Iowa, but I didn't correct him. We finished the cornbread. I left him the rest of the box. On the bus home somewhere in Pennsylvania, I did the arithmetic I'd been avoiding since October. Not money arithmetic. The other kind. I counted the times in the past 2 years that Ethan had called just to call, not to ask for something, not to report something, just to talk the way we used to talk, on Sunday mornings when he was at Cornell and the world was still the size it was supposed to be. I came up with 3 times in 2 years. I looked at that number for a long time. In the dark of the bus, the highway unreeling outside the window, and I tried to decide what a man does with a number like that. I got home at 6 in the morning. Martha was already up, coffee made, standing at the kitchen window watching the field. She turned when I came in and looked at me the way she looks when she already knows and is deciding whether to say so. "Get your parts?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. She poured me a cup of coffee and set it on the table and went back to looking out the window. I sat down and put both hands around the cup and let it warm my palms. "Arthur," she said without turning around. "I'm all right," I said. She didn't answer that. She just stood at the window with her coffee, and I sat at the table with mine, and the field outside was gray and frozen, and neither of us said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying just then. The following month, the envelope came. I opened it. I transferred the money. I wrote the date and the amount in the notebook and closed it. I don't know how to explain that except to say that a man can know a thing completely and still need more time before he can act on it. The heart is slower than the mind. I've found that to be true in most things that matter. Martha told me about the appointment 3 months after it happened. She didn't plan to tell me. She told me because I asked her directly the night after I found the 2 prescription bottles in her nightstand drawer, the new one and the empty one with a date 9 months prior. And I sat across from her at the kitchen table and said quietly that I needed her to tell me what was going on. So what I know about that March morning, I know from her. I'm going to tell it the way she told it. Dr. Patricia Evans has run the family practice on 2nd Street in Ankeny for 22 years. She delivered half the babies in this county during the 90s, stitched up the other half at some point after that, and has known the Miller family long enough to remember when Ethan was afraid of the blood pressure cuff. She is 55 years old, direct in the way that only comes from decades of telling people things they don't want to hear, and she has never once in my experience said something she didn't mean. Martha went in on a Wednesday morning in March, telling me she had a routine checkup. I was in the workshop. I didn't think about it again until supper. Dr. Evans wrapped the cuff around Martha's arm and pumped it, and read the gauge and said nothing. She pumped it again. A third time. 158/96. She set the cuff down on the counter and looked at Martha. "When did you last take your medication?" she asked. Martha said she'd been a little inconsistent lately. Dr. Evans pulled up the prescription history on her computer. The last refill on record was 9 months ago. She looked at the screen. She looked at Martha. She picked up her pen and set it down without writing anything. "How long, Martha?" she said. Martha looked at her hands in her lap. 9 months, she said. Give or take. Dr. Evans leaned back in her chair. She had known Martha Miller for 20 years. She knew what kind of woman sat across from her, the kind who shows up for everyone else and doesn't make a fuss about herself, the kind who would work around a problem rather than name it if naming it caused someone else discomfort. "Why?" Dr. Evans asked. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said 3 words. "The cost adds up." Dr. Evans didn't ask what that meant. She understood what it meant. She'd seen enough of the inside of people's lives to know that 3 words like that are never really about the thing they appear to be about. She wrote a new prescription. Higher dose because 9 months of uncontrolled hypertension had moved Martha's numbers into a range that required more aggressive management. She explained the risk clearly and directly sustained elevated blood pressure at Martha's age significantly increased the likelihood of a cardiovascular event. A stroke. She used that word. She said Martha needed to understand that this was not a situation to manage quietly. Martha nodded and said she understood. She paid for the appointment in cash, counted the bills out from her purse onto the counter 1s and 5s, the kind of money that comes from a jar on a shelf from selling eggs and embroidered dish towels at the Saturday market. Dr. Evans watched her count without saying anything. After Martha left, Dr. Evans sat in the examination room by herself for a few minutes. She thought about Ethan Miller, the boy who had come in every year for his school physical, who had broken his collarbone in the 8th grade falling out of a tree, who had gone off to Cornell and come back at Christmas looking like a different version of himself each time. She thought about what 3 words like the cost adds up meant when they came from Martha Miller in a room like this one. She capped her pen. She put Martha's chart away. She went to see her next patient. It was not her place to act on what she knew, but she remembered it. She put it in the place she kept things that weren't ready yet. Martha told me she filled the new prescription that afternoon and put the bottle in her nightstand drawer. Not the shared drawer. Her drawer. She didn't tell me because she knew what I would do with the information. She knew I would feel responsible, which I was, and that I would try to fix it in the way I fix things, which would mean sending less money, which would mean Ethan would call, which would mean a conversation she wasn't sure either of us was ready to have. So she kept it in her drawer and took her pill every morning and didn't say a word. I wasn't protecting him, she told me when she finally explained all of it at our kitchen table. I was protecting you from knowing what you'd already decided. I sat with that for a long time. There's a version of love that looks like strength and is actually just a very organized way of carrying more than your share. Martha has practiced that version her whole life. I recognized it because I had spent 15 months practicing my own version right alongside her in the same house at the same table without either of us saying a word about it to the other. We were both so busy holding things up that we never thought to ask each other what we were holding. Type 62 in the comments if you're still with me. That's Arthur's age. That's how long some men wait before they finally say enough. Some details in this story were shaped for the telling. If this isn't for you, it's okay to step away now. The machine parts story had worked well enough in December. In April, I used the furnace filter. I told Martha I needed to run into Ankeny for furnace filters and a few things from the hardware store. She was reading in the living room and said to pick up coffee while I was out. I said I would. I drove to the hardware store, bought the filters and the coffee, and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, thinking about the notebook in the desk drawer and the number at the bottom of the last page. $71,400. 15 months. The machine had been running so long, I wasn't sure I remembered how to stop it. That's the honest truth of it. Not that I was afraid of Ethan, not that I didn't know what needed doing. Just that a system, once it has run long enough, starts to feel like weather. You don't decide to have weather. You just live in it. I drove home, made dinner, did the dishes, went out to the workshop at 8 o'clock. The phone rang at 10:47. I looked at the screen, wiped my hands on my work apron, picked up. "Ethan," I said. "Where is it?" No greeting. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, but the thing that lives just behind it, when a man has decided that patience is no longer required. "The transfer was due 4 days ago. I've got the mortgage payment coming out Friday, and the account is sitting at $1,100. "The planer needed repair," I said. "It set me back a couple weeks." Dad." He said my name the way you say a word when you want it to mean something different than it means. "I need you to understand what a late transfer does to us. Jessica had to move money around. It was embarrassing. You don't just get to decide on your own timeline when this happens." I set down the sanding block I'd been holding. I looked at the oak chair in the corner of the workshop. I thought about a man I'd known years ago, neighbor 1 county over, who had taken his son to court over a property dispute. Won every dollar he was owed. I had watched what winning cost him. I wasn't willing to make that trade. "Ethan," I said, "I want to ask you something." "What?" When did you last call your mother just to talk to her? Not about money, not about timing, just to ask how she was doing." Silence on the line. The workshop hum of the overhead light. "That's not what this is about," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm asking anyway." Another silence. Then his voice shifted, the edge dropping away, and something harder coming up underneath it, the way a river bottom appears when the water goes down. "You had me so you could have someone to take care of you when you got old. That's the deal, Dad." He said, "Parents have kids, kids take care of parents. Now you want to act like that's not how it works." I stood very still in the workshop. I thought about 12 acres of topsoil in Polk County. I thought about a prescription bottle with a date 9 months prior. I thought about a shoebox of cornbread on a bench at Port Authority and a man named Curtis who didn't ask questions. "You're 28 years old, Ethan," I said. "I have given you everything I had to give. Now it's time for you to figure out how to stand on your own 2 feet." I ended the call. I sat down on the stool beside the workbench. The workshop was quiet. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the cornfield, that particular sound, like paper being shuffled by someone in another room. I didn't go back inside for a long time. When I did, Martha was standing in the kitchen in her robe with the light on over the stove. She looked at my face and didn't say anything for a moment. "Arthur," she said. "Who called?" I looked at my wife. 38 years. The woman who had counted out cash on a doctor's counter and said 3 words and carried the answer home in her nightstand drawer to protect me from it. "Wrong number," I said. The worst lie I had ever told her. She knew it. I knew she knew it. We stood in the kitchen under the stove light, and neither of us moved for a moment, and then Martha turned and went back to the bedroom, and I stood alone in the kitchen until the light felt like too much, and I turned it off. The next morning, I opened the notebook. I looked at the last entry. I picked up the pen and drew a line under the final number 1 clean horizontal line, the way you close a ledger. $71,400. Done. I did not transfer money that month, or the month after. At the end of April, Caleb called to check in, the way he'd been doing every few weeks since October. I told him in 4 words, I stopped the transfers. He was quiet a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. I looked out the workshop window at the place where the east field used to be. "Well, like I set something down that I'd been carrying for a long time," I said. "And my arms don't know what to do with themselves yet." I learned what happened in New York, the way you learn most things after the fact in pieces from different people at different times. Ethan told me some of it sitting at my kitchen table 6 weeks later. Caleb filled in the rest. I've put it together as best I can. The morning of May 3rd, Ethan opened his banking app and looked at the number for a long time. $1,203. 3 joint credit cards at their limits. Combined debt $94,000 accumulated over 15 months of living at a standard neither of their salaries could sustain without the transfers from Iowa. Without the transfers, the whole architecture came visible at once. The professional collapse came first. Ethan had been running on poor sleep and worse judgment for months, and in late April, he signed off on a derivatives contract without reading the counterparty clause. The error exposed a client fund to $2.3 million in liability. Under the terms of his employment and his fiduciary obligations to the firm's clients, Apex Capital had no choice. They terminated him the same afternoon, and their legal department sent a document alongside the termination letter, a preservation of claims notice, informing Ethan that the firm reserved the right to pursue a breach of fiduciary duty action against him to recover losses. He was 28 years old, with a box of desk items and a potential civil lawsuit riding home in the cab with him. Losing the job meant losing the employer health insurance immediately. COBRA continuation cover, the federal program that allows terminated employees to keep their existing insurance, would cost $1,847 per month. They could not afford it. The bank sent a notice of default on the apartment 60 days after the first missed mortgage payment. Under New York state law, a lender must provide written notice and a mandatory settlement conference before foreclosure proceedings can advance, which meant they had time, but not much, and not the kind of time that felt like anything other than a clock. Jessica called her mother in Pasadena. Linda picked up, listened to 30 seconds of the situation, and said she needed to call back. She did not call back. Jessica's father, Richard, called instead in his attorney's voice and explained that Jessica was a married adult, and this was a matter between her and her husband and their creditors. Jessica drove to Pasadena anyway. She stood on her mother's front step with a bag over her shoulder and rang the bell. Linda opened the door. She looked at her daughter for a moment. The bag, the expression, the way Jessica was standing, like someone who had just run out of road. "I told you," Linda said, "not to marry a farm boy. They always drag you down to their level eventually." She said it without cruelty. That was almost worse, the flatness of it, the certainty, as though she were reading a fact from a document she'd prepared years in advance. The door closed. Jessica stood on the step for a while. She thought about what her mother had just said. She'd heard versions of that sentence her whole life, and it had always landed as obvious. Of course you married up. Of course you protected your position. Of course the people below you pulled downward if you let them get close enough. But standing on that step in May with her bag on her shoulder, something shifted. She thought about Martha Miller, a woman who had paid a doctor's bill in 1s and 5s from a jar on a shelf. A woman who had put an old pair of rubber boots outside a shed door for a daughter-in-law she had every right to turn away. The thought arrived without invitation, and it did not leave. She drove back to New York. That evening, she sat across from Ethan in the apartment they could no longer afford, and looked at the man she had married. He looked hollowed out, in the way that only happens when the thing holding a person up has been removed all at once. "We could go to Iowa," he said. It was not a question. He said it the way a person states a fact they've already accepted, waiting to see if the other person has gotten there yet. Jessica looked at her hands on the table. The manicure she'd gotten 3 weeks ago was chipping at the edges. She thought about rubber boots and 1s and 5s, and a woman who had told a room full of strangers that her family's situation was very comfortable. "Iowa," she said. She did not say it as a question either. Ethan called Caleb from the kitchen while Jessica started packing. Caleb picked up on the second ring. "I don't know if he'll open the door," Ethan said. Caleb was quiet a moment. "There's only one way to find out," he said. They rented a car one way from a budget location near their apartment. They left most of the furniture. What they took fit in the trunk and the back seat. Ethan drove. Jessica sat in the passenger seat and watched New York shrink in the side mirror until it was gone, and there was only highway and distance and the long, flat approach of the Midwest coming up ahead of them. "He called me from somewhere in Ohio. I was in the workshop." "Dad," he said, "we're coming home." I set down what I was working on. "All right," I said. We hung up. I sat in the workshop for a few minutes. Then I went outside and looked at the front door, the faded blue, the crack along the bottom panel, and I thought about what kind of man opens a door, and what kind closes it, and which kind I intended to be. They pulled up at 4:20 in the afternoon. I was on the tractor in the east section of the field when I heard the gravel. A rental car sound too smooth for anything local, moving slow, the way people move when they're not sure of their welcome. I cut the engine, sat up there for a moment, looking at the car stopped at the gate. New York plates. I climbed down and walked across the field. Ethan got out first. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he'd left in, good jeans, a collared shirt, but they sat differently on him now, like a suit on a man who has lost weight since the fitting. He looked at me, and then at the ground, and then back at me. He had his mother's eyes, and right then they were doing what her eyes do when she's holding something heavy and trying not to show it. Jessica got out of the passenger side. She stood by the car door with her hand still on the frame, like she wasn't sure she'd been invited to step away from it. I looked at my son. I looked at the 2 suitcases in the back seat visible through the window. I waited. "I lost my job," Ethan said. "We lost the apartment. We don't have anywhere else to go." 15 seconds. That was the whole explanation. To his credit, he didn't dress it up. I didn't ask questions. I turned and walked to the storage shed at the edge of the field, the one I use for seed stock and equipment that doesn't fit in the main workshop. I took the padlock off and pushed the door open. Inside a cot I'd used during the long harvest seasons, when it was easier to sleep near the field than walk back to the house. A work light on an extension cord. A bathroom outside around the back of the barn. "There's a cot in the back," I said. "Bathroom's outside. Breakfast is at 5 if you want it." I didn't look at Ethan when I said it. I put the padlock on the ground, walked back to the tractor, climbed up, and started the engine. I didn't look back. Martha was at the kitchen window. I knew without looking that she'd seen everything. When I came in for supper, she had 2 extra plates set out not on the kitchen table on the counter by the door covered with a dish towel. For whenever. However. Her way of leaving a door open without making a ceremony of it. I didn't say anything. She didn't either. We ate. The first 2 mornings, I was out the door at 4, and neither of them was up. The third morning, I came downstairs at 3:50, and through the kitchen window I could see the shed light already on. By the time I got to the field, Ethan was there. He didn't say good morning. He picked up a tool and started working. I watched him for a moment, the way he held it wrong at first, then adjusting, and then I turned and started on my section. We worked that way until the sun came up, and neither of us spoke, and it was the most honest conversation we'd had in 2 years. On the 4th day, I noticed Jessica's heeled shoes by the shed door caked with Iowa mud beyond saving. That evening, I took Martha's old rubber boots from the back porch. She had 2 pairs, and hadn't worn this set since her knees started bothering her, and I set them outside the shed door. No note. I went back inside. The 3rd night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about the notebook in the desk drawer. About the oak chair in the workshop corner. About a man sitting in a bus station in December with an empty shoebox. At 11 o'clock, I got up. I dressed in the dark so I wouldn't wake Martha. I went to the desk and took out the notebook. I carried it across the yard in the dark, the gravel cold under my boots, and I set it down on the step outside the shed door. I didn't knock. I set it down carefully, the way you set down something that has been heavy for a long time, and you are finally ready to let someone else see how heavy it was. Then I walked back to the house. I was at the kitchen window with a glass of water when I saw the shed door open. Ethan stepped out in the dark. He looked down at the notebook on the step. He picked it up. He stood there in the yard under the May stars, still cold at night in Iowa, and looked at the cover for a long time without opening it. Then Jessica appeared in the shed doorway behind him. She said something I couldn't hear. He held up the notebook without turning around. I set my glass down and went back to bed. I lay in the dark and thought, he knows now. Whatever comes next, he knows. Martha turned over beside me and put her hand on my arm the way she does when she's not quite asleep and wants to make sure I'm still there. I put my hand over hers. We lay like that until morning. He read it on the shed step with a flashlight. I know because Martha saw him from the bedroom window when she got up for water at 2 in the morning. She didn't wake me. She just stood at the window and watched and came back to bed and lay there without saying anything until morning, which is the most eloquent thing Martha Miller has ever done. She told me later she watched him turn pages for over an hour. I can reconstruct what he read because I wrote it, every word of it, in the particular shorthand of a man who keeps records the way other people keep secrets, not to show anyone, just to know. February 2024, 2,500, April $3,000 bonus insufficient per Ethan. June $2,800, August $3,200 building assessment. And alongside each entry in smaller writing, the source. Sold hydraulic splitter, 4,200. Sold backup planer, 4,200. IRA early withdrawal, $29,000. Penalty paid, $2,900. Harvest reserve, $14,000. And the lines. 9 of them, each one drawn through the same 3 words, Martha medication, $180. At the bottom of the last page, one horizontal line under the final number. $71,400. Nothing after it. I don't know exactly what Ethan felt reading that. He's never described it to me in full, and I haven't asked him to. Some things a man processes in private and carries forward differently after. What I know is what I observed in the days that followed, which told me more than any conversation could have. The morning after he read the notebook, he was in the field before me, not by a few minutes. By the time I came out at 4, he had already been working for an unspecified amount of time. The evidence was in the ground, a section cleared that hadn't been when I'd checked at dusk. He didn't look up when I arrived. I didn't acknowledge him. We worked side by side until the sun cleared the tree line, and neither of us spoke. And something that had been stuck between us for 2 years moved slightly the way ice moves in early March. Not breaking, just shifting. Jessica found his notebook 3 days later. Not my notebook. His. A small spiral bound he'd kept in the inside pocket of his jacket for, as best she could tell from the dates inside, about 18 months. She found it doing laundry, the way you find things people carry close to themselves and forget you might encounter. She sat on the shed floor with it in her lap and read it. The first pages were budget calculations, expense tracking, the familiar arithmetic of a man trying to make numbers work that don't. But near the middle, the entries changed character. Less calculation. More list. Things I'm going to get them when I actually make it. What followed was 2 pages in Ethan's handwriting, careful, smaller than his usual script, like he was trying to fit more onto the page than the page wanted to hold. A new John Deere tractor model and specs noted. A water filtration system for the kitchen because the well had been running mineral heavy for years, and Martha had mentioned it once and probably forgotten she mentioned it, and Ethan had not. A trip to Niagara Falls, Mom mentioned it on the Christmas call, 2021. She said she'd never been. She laughed it off. Write it down. A reading chair for the front porch, the kind with wide arms. New paint on every fence post on the property. At the very bottom, added later in slightly different ink. A note. Just a note that says, "Thank you." No envelope. Just the words. Nothing in the list had been purchased. Every item sat there in his handwriting untouched, like a door he'd been meaning to open and kept walking past. Jessica sat on the shed floor with her back against the washing machine and did not move for a long time. She was still sitting there when I walked past the shed window on my way back from the field. I didn't look in deliberately, I just caught the shape of her through the glass. The stillness of a person who has been stopped by something they weren't prepared for. I kept walking. That afternoon, Ethan was carrying a 50-pound feed bag across the yard when he stopped. The cough started low and built fast, the kind that doubles a man over whether he intends it to or not. He went down on one knee in the gravel. When he straightened up and looked at his hand, there was blood on his palm, not much, but enough. He looked at it for a moment. He wiped his hand on his jeans. He stood up, picked up the feed bag, and kept walking. He didn't know I was watching from the workshop doorway. I stood there after he'd gone around the corner of the barn, and I looked at the place in the gravel where he'd knelt. And I thought about my son carrying a feed bag and a notebook full of things he meant to do, and something in his chest that was bleeding, and I understood that I was done waiting for the right moment. There is no right moment. There is only the moment you have. Martha was collecting eggs at 6 in the morning, when Jessica appeared in the henhouse doorway. She didn't knock. There was nothing to knock on. She just stood there in the entrance in Martha's rubber boots, which were 2 sizes too big and had left marks on her heels that she hadn't mentioned to anyone. She looked at Martha crouched between the nesting boxes and said, "Can I help with something?" Martha looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Ed, come here." That was the whole invitation. Martha showed her how to slide a hand under a hen without startling it. How to cup the egg before you lift, not after. How to tell by the weight alone whether it was fresh. Jessica's first attempt sent the hen sideways and the egg rolling, and she grabbed for it with both hands and caught it a foot above the ground. And Martha said, "Good hands." In the flat way, she says things that are compliments. They worked through the rest of the boxes without talking much. At some point, Martha said, not looking up from what she was doing, "First winter Arthur and I were married. We didn't have a furnace. Space heater in the bedroom, nothing in the rest of the house. I told him it was an adventure." She paused. "He believed me because he needed to, and I let him believe it because sometimes that's what you do." Jessica turned an egg over in her palm. "Did you believe it?" she asked. "Some mornings," Martha said. That was enough. They finished the boxes. Martha handed Jessica the basket to carry back. Jessica took it with both hands and followed her across the yard, the rubber boots flopping slightly with each step. And she thought about her mother's house in Pasadena, the way every room in it was arranged to show well, the way every conversation in it was arranged the same way. And she thought about this yard, this basket, these boots, and the distance between the two felt like more than miles. Inside, Martha put the coffee on and didn't tell Jessica to sit down, which meant Jessica sat down anyway. She had been carrying Ethan's small notebook in her jacket pocket since she found it. She took it out now and set it on the table. "I found this in his jacket," she said, "when I was doing laundry." Martha looked at it. She didn't reach for it. "He has a list," Jessica said. "Things he was going to get you both, when he made it." She stopped. "He wrote down the Niagara Falls thing, from a Christmas call in 2021. He wrote it down and kept it." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't think he remembered that." "He remembered," Jessica said. Martha poured the coffee and set a cup in front of Jessica and one at her own place and sat down. She looked at the notebook on the table between them. "He also wrote something about you," Jessica said. "About how you looked tired, that you were thinner than last year." She kept her eyes on the cup. He noticed. He just didn't ask. Martha wrapped both hands around her coffee. Outside this kitchen window, the field was bright with early summer light, the corn coming up in its rows, everything green and exact. "None of you asked," Martha said. Not as an accusation, just as a fact stated plainly, the way she states facts. Jessica didn't answer that. There was no answer that wasn't an apology, and an apology felt too small for the size of the thing. That evening in the shed, Jessica told Ethan what she and Martha had talked about. She told him about the notebook and what Martha had said, and what she herself had not been able to say. Ethan sat on the edge of the cot and listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then the cough came sudden, the kind that has been waiting, and he turned away and put his forearm against his mouth, and when he lowered it, she saw his face, and she knew. "Ethan," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not." She sat down beside him. "How long has it been like this?" He looked at his hands. "A few weeks." "Blood. A beat." "Sometimes." She sat with that. Outside the shed, the field was going dark. the last light falling out of the sky in long strips. A whippoorwill started up somewhere out past the barn. "We have to tell them," she said. "Not yet," he said. "Ethan." She put her hand on his arm. "I found your list. I know what you've been carrying around in your jacket for 18 months. You don't have to keep doing this by yourself." He didn't answer right away. She waited. "I don't know how to tell him," Ethan said finally. "I don't know how to sit in front of my father and say I need help. Not after everything." Jessica looked at him. This man she had married in a room full of flowers, neither of them had chosen this man, who had written down her mother-in-law's offhand mention of Niagara Falls, and kept it in his pocket for 4 years. "I'll figure something out," she said. She said it quietly, the way a person says a thing when they are making a decision at the same time they are saying it. Ethan told Arthur he needed to run into Ankeny for tractor parts. Arthur was at the workbench when Ethan said it, his back turned sanding the edge of a cabinet door. He didn't look up. "Keys are on the hook," he said. Ethan took the keys. He drove Arthur's truck into town. He did not go to the hardware store. Dr. Patricia Evans has run her practice on 2nd Street for 22 years, and she has a policy of fitting in patients she's known since childhood when they call in the morning and say they need to come in. Ethan called at 8. She told him to come at 10. He sat in the waiting room for 12 minutes, surrounded by the same framed photographs that had been on those walls his entire life. The Ankeny County Fair, a winter field, a portrait of the clinic's founding doctor from 1962, who looked startlingly like his own grandfather. Then the nurse called his name and he went in. Dr. Evans reviewed the CT scan results and set the folder on the counter and looked at him directly. "A benign tumor," she said. "Lower lobe right lung. 2.3 centimeters. It's been bleeding." She said it the way she says everything without softening it, because softening it doesn't change it. "You need surgery. Video-assisted thoracoscopic surgery. They go in through small incisions, no open chest. University of Iowa Hospitals does it routinely. Recovery is 6 to 8 weeks. "What's the cost?" Ethan asked. "Without insurance. 38 to 52,000 depending on complications. The hospital has a financial assistance program income-based. You'd likely qualify." She paused. "Does your father know you're here?" Ethan looked at the county fair photograph on the wall. "No." Dr. Evans picked up her pen and set it down again, the same gesture she'd made in this room with his mother 3 months earlier, with different information and the same weight behind it. "I think he should know," she said. "Well, I know," Ethan said. "I just need a little time to figure out how to tell him." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Don't take too long." He drove back to the farm and parked the truck and went back to the field without going inside. He worked until supper. He didn't tell Jessica what the doctor had said, but when she looked at him across the shed that evening, she understood from his face that whatever it was real. She had been thinking all day about what she'd said the night before. "I'll figure something out." At 9 o'clock, after Ethan had fallen asleep, she got up. She put on her jacket. She crossed the yard in the dark and knocked on the back door of the house. Martha answered in her robe. She looked at Jessica standing on the step in the dark and didn't say anything, just held the door open. They sat at the kitchen table. Martha made tea without asking if Jessica wanted any. "Ethan went to see Dr. Evans today," Jessica said. "He didn't go for tractor parts." Martha set down the mugs. "He has a tumor in his lung," Jessica said. "Benign, but it's been bleeding. He needs surgery. $38,000 minimum, and we have $1,200. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside the window, the field was dark and still. "He doesn't know I'm telling you this," Jessica said. He'd say he was handling it. He's not handling it. He's carrying it the same way he carries everything alone in his jacket pocket, hoping it turns into something manageable before anyone has to find out. Martha wrapped both hands around her mug. "Does he know you're here?" she asked. "No," Jessica said. Martha nodded slowly. She looked at the table for a moment, the grain of the wood, the ring left by Arthur's coffee cup that morning, that she hadn't wiped yet. "You did the right thing," Martha said. She said it simply without ceremony, the way she says things that are true and don't require decoration. Jessica looked at her hands around the mug. The chipped manicure was completely gone now, her nails short, her palms showing the beginning of calluses from weeks of real work. She looked like different hands than the ones she'd arrived with. "I should have done it sooner," she said. "You did it now," Martha said. "That's what matters." They sat together at the kitchen table until the tea was gone. Martha walked her to the door. On the step, Jessica turned and said, "What are you going to do?" Martha looked past her at the dark yard, at the shed with its light off, at the field beyond it. "What we do," she said. She said it quietly, like it was the simplest sentence in the world, and went back inside. "Before I tell you what Martha hid in that drawer for 6 years, type blue if you want to know the truth. This story contains fictional elements created for reflection and meaning. If that's not for you, feel free to find what suits you better." Martha told me over coffee at the kitchen table the next morning. She waited until I had both hands around my cup and was fully awake, which is her way of making sure I hear things the way they were meant to be heard. Then she told me what Jessica had said the night before: the tumor, the surgery, the cost, the $1,200 they had between them. She told it in the order it happened, plainly, without editorializing. When she finished, I sat there for a while. Through the kitchen window, I could see Ethan already in the field, moving along the far fence line, his back to the house. Doing what he'd been doing every morning for 2 weeks, working before anyone could ask him to, working past what his body was ready for, working the way a man works when he doesn't know any other language for what he's trying to say. "How long have you known she was going to tell me?" I asked. Martha looked at her coffee. "I didn't know. I hoped. I drove to Ankeny that morning and found Dr. Evans between patients. I told her Martha had, and I asked her what I needed to know from a medical standpoint. She told me the details, the timeline, the procedure. She confirmed what Martha had said and filled in what Martha hadn't known to ask. She said the University of Iowa Hospital's financial assistance program was income-based, and given our household situation, I should apply immediately. She said the surgical team there did VATS procedures regularly, and the outcomes for benign tumors caught at this stage were excellent. She said he needed to go in within 6 weeks. I thanked her and drove home. In the kitchen, I opened the desk drawer and took out my notebook, the brown hardcover, the one with the line at the bottom of the last page. I set it on the table. I sat there looking at it. Martha came in from the garden and saw me sitting there and sat down across from me without saying anything. We stayed like that for a moment. Then she stood up, went to the bedroom, and came back with something I had never seen before: a savings passbook. Green cover, soft with age. She set it on the table in front of me. "I've been keeping this for 6 years, she said. "I didn't tell you because I knew what you'd do with it." I opened it. The entries went back to the first year we started sending money to New York. Small deposits, irregular, the kind of amounts that come from egg sales and Saturday market, and the occasional embroidery order. 1s and 5s turned into 10s, turned into a number at the bottom of the last page that I had to look at twice. $28,500. "Martha," I said. "I was saving it," she said, "for when we really needed it." I looked up at her. The woman across the table from me had paid a doctor in cash, had kept this book in a drawer I'd never opened, had watched me work until 11 every night, and said nothing had put rubber boots outside a shed door for a woman she had every reason to turn away. She had done all of it without asking me to notice. "I should have told you," I said. "About New York, about the call, about all of it." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She said it without anger, just acknowledgement. The way you confirm a fact that doesn't need to be argued about anymore. That afternoon, I drove to Iowa City alone. University of Iowa Hospitals sits on the west bank of the Iowa River, a complex of buildings that has been expanded so many times, it looks like it grew rather than was built. I found the financial counseling office on the second floor. A woman named Denise walked me through the application income verification assets household size. She said based on what I described, Ethan would likely qualify for significant assistance, possibly 60 to 70% of the surgical cost. The remainder could be arranged as a payment plan over 24 months at no interest. I filled out what I could and left the rest for Ethan to complete. I folded the papers and put them in my shirt pocket and drove home. It was nearly dark when I pulled into the drive. Ethan was sitting on the fence at the edge of the field, the way he used to sit when he was a boy and wanted to think. He watched my truck come up the gravel. I parked. I got out. I walked over to the fence and stood beside him. The field was going to purple in the evening light, the corn rows straight and even running all the way to the tree line. I took the papers from my shirt pocket and held them out. He looked at them. He looked at me. "University of Iowa," I said. "Financial assistance. You fill out your part, they'll cover most of it. The rest we do on a payment plan." Ethan took the papers. He held them in both hands and looked down at them for a moment. His jaw moved. "Dad," he said. "I know," I said. We stood at the fence in the half-dark, and I thought about a boy who used to sit on this same fence and tell me about his day at school and ask me questions I didn't always have answers to. And I thought about how that boy had become someone who carried his debts and his illnesses and his lists of unfinished kindnesses all in his jacket pocket alone. Because somewhere along the way, he'd learned that was what you were supposed to do. I didn't know yet if that was something I'd taught him or something he'd learned around me. Either way, it was time to stop. At 9 o'clock that evening, Martha appeared in the workshop doorway with her jacket on. She didn't say anything. She looked at me and then toward the shed and then back at me. I put down what I was working on and got my jacket off the hook by the door. We crossed the yard together without a word between us, which is the way Martha and I have always moved when we both already know where we're going and why. The gravel was cold under my boots. The field beyond the fence line was dark, the corn just a suggestion of shape against the sky. Somewhere past the barn, a whippoorwill had been going for the better part of an hour, the same four-note call patient and insistent the way only birds and very old grief can manage. The shed light was on the thin line of it visible under the door. I knocked twice, not loudly, just enough. A moment passed. Then footsteps. Then Ethan opened the door. He was still in his work clothes, the knees of his jeans dark with field dirt, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding something heavy all day and knows the holding isn't finished yet. He looked at us. He looked at the yard behind us, as if checking whether anyone else had come. He stepped outside and sat down on the shed step without being asked, which told me he'd been expecting this and had been trying to decide how he felt about it for longer than just tonight. I sat down beside him. The step was narrow, and our shoulders touched and neither of us moved away. Martha stood at the door. A moment later, Jessica appeared behind her in the shed entrance, still in her work jacket, her hair pulled back the way it had been every day since she stopped caring how it looked. which was about 2 weeks in. Martha moved slightly to one side, and the two women stood there together in the doorway without speaking. I had a thought then, that I've had a few times since, that the women in a family often understand things before the men do and wait for the men to catch up, and that this patience is a kind of love that doesn't get named often enough. The night was warm. The whippoorwill kept on. The cornfield moved in a slow, collective way in the light wind, the way it does on nights like this, like something breathing. I looked at my son sitting beside me on that step. "Does it hurt?" I said. "When you breathe." He turned his head toward me. Not surprised exactly, more like a man who hears the question he's been waiting for and isn't sure he's ready now that it's finally here. "The lung," I said. "Does it hurt?" His jaw tightened. He looked at his hands in his lap, the same hands he'd used to hold a feed bag that afternoon, while something in his chest bled quietly, and he didn't say a word to anyone. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "It hurts." I sat with that for a moment. The whippoorwill, the corn moving, Martha very still in the doorway. "Tell me," I said. So he did. He told me about the cough that started in May, the morning he'd knelt in the gravel and looked at his palm and understood that this was not something he could walk off. He told me about driving my truck to Dr. Evans's office and sitting in that waiting room surrounded by photographs from the Ankeny County Fair, knowing he was going to hear something he couldn't unhear. He told me about the number $38,000 and how he and Jessica had taken jobs washing dishes at the Route 30 diner because they'd run the arithmetic and found a gap between what they had and what they needed. That math said couldn't be closed in any honest way, but they'd tried anyway, because that's what you do when you've run out of other options, and you're too ashamed to ask the people who would help you without question. He talked for a long time. His voice broke once near the middle, and he stopped and looked at the field until it steadied. I didn't fill the silence. Some silences are not empty, they're working. When he finished, Martha stepped forward. She put both hands on either side of his face the way she had when he was small and had come home from school with a problem. He didn't know how to explain the way she had when he was 7 and broke his arm falling out of the apple tree and couldn't stop shaking long enough to tell her where it hurt. She looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Ethan closed his eyes. His shoulders came down about 2 inches, the way a man's shoulders come down when he finally stops bracing for the impact he's been expecting. Then he bent forward and put his face in his hands, and the sound that came out of him was not crying exactly. It was something older than crying, something that had been waiting in a place below words for a long time. The sound a man makes when he has been strong in the wrong direction for too long, and something in him finally gives way toward the right one. Martha put her hand on the back of his head. She kept it there. Jessica stood in the shed doorway with both arms crossed over her chest, holding herself together. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't looking away. She was watching her husband the way you watch someone you love, when you finally understand the full weight of what they've been carrying, and the way you watch yourself too, for having helped add to it without knowing you were doing it. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and neither of us looked away. I opened the green savings passbook and held it out to Ethan. He lifted his head. Martha had taken her hands back, but stayed close, her shoulder against his. "Your mother has been keeping this for 6 years, I said. "She didn't tell me because she knew I'd send it to you." I paused. She was right. Ethan took the passbook. He opened it. He looked at the entries, the 1s and 5s from egg sales, the occasional larger deposit from an embroidery order. 6 years of small and careful accumulation. He turned to the last page and looked at the number at the bottom for a long time. He looked at Martha. She had turned slightly away the way she does when she doesn't want her face to do what it's doing. "Mom," he said. "It's enough to start," she said without turning around. "The hospital will do the rest on a plan." He stood up. He put his arms around her from behind his chin on her shoulder, and she reached up and put both hands over his forearms and held on. She held on the way you hold on to something you were afraid you'd lost, and then found again in the last place you thought to look. Jessica made a sound in the doorway. Not words, just the sound a person makes when something they've been watching through glass finally breaks through. I stood up. I looked at the shed, the cot, the work light on its extension cord, the rubber boots by the door that Martha had left there without being asked and without saying a word about it. Then I looked at my son and his wife standing in the yard in the dark, and I thought about all the things I might have said at a moment like this, the accounting I might have done, the tally of cost and loss, and what it had taken to arrive here. I thought about all of it, and I let it go. "Unpack what you need," I said. "You're sleeping inside tonight. Both of you." I walked back toward the house. At the porch steps, I stopped. "Ethan," I said without turning around. "We'll go to Iowa City Monday morning." I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and I stayed there until I heard the shed door close one final time and footsteps cross the yard. Two sets slow, the sound of people who are no longer in a hurry because the worst of the waiting is over, and the back door opened and the house filled up again with the sound of people who belong in it. I thought about a cot in a storage shed and a passbook in a nightstand drawer and a notebook with a line at the bottom of the last page, and I understood that the line hadn't been an ending after all. It had been making room. We left for Iowa City at 5 in the morning. I drove. Martha sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, the way she sits when she is praying without wanting anyone to know she's praying. Ethan and Jessica were in the back. For the first hour, nobody said much, just the highway and the early light coming up flat across the fields, the kind of Iowa morning that arrives without drama and asks nothing of you except to keep moving. I watched the fields go by in the gray light. Corn already waist-high in July, the rows running straight to the horizon, the way they always have, the way they'll keep running long after everyone in this car is gone. I thought about my father farming 40 years of mornings like this one. I thought about the east field, specifically the way the topsoil smelled after rain, the way the stalks would rattle in a west wind like they were talking to each other. I thought about a boy who used to ride on the tractor with me and ask questions I didn't always know how to answer. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ethan was looking out the window at the fields with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between recognition and grief, the look of a man seeing something he'd tried to outrun, and finding it had been waiting for him all along. Caleb was already there when we arrived. I had called him the night before. One sentence. "Ethan's going in tomorrow morning." He'd driven down from Iowa City, which was no distance at all for him, but the point was never the distance. Caleb Johnson has always understood that showing up is its own language, and that some things don't need explaining. He was standing outside the surgical unit entrance in his work jacket. When we came through the main doors, his hair still damp from a shower he'd clearly rushed, a paper cup of coffee in each hand. He held one out to Martha without a word. She took it and squeezed his arm, and that was the whole exchange, and it was enough. We filled the row of plastic chairs outside the surgical unit. Me at one end, then Martha, then Caleb, then Jessica. 4 people under fluorescent lights, which is one of the lonelier arrangements a life can put you in. And also I found one of the more honest ones. You can't perform anything in a hospital waiting room for very long. Eventually the lights strip it all away, and you're just a person who loves someone and doesn't know what's happening on the other side of a door. Before they took Ethan in, he stood with us in the hallway. He was already in the hospital gown, the kind that doesn't close all the way in the back, and makes even the most composed person look suddenly young and uncertain. He shook my hand. I pulled him in and held on. He let me. When we stepped apart, his eyes were dry but working hard to stay that way. "Dad," he said. That was all. "I know," I said. "Go." He went. Caleb sat next to Jessica. After a few minutes, he looked at the floor and then said without preamble, "He used to talk about his dad every single day in high school. Did you know that?" Jessica shook her head. "Every day," Caleb said. Something his dad built, something his dad said, something his dad knew how to do that Caleb couldn't figure out, and Ethan thought was the greatest thing he'd ever seen. He turned the paper cup in his hands. "I thought about telling you that a long time ago. I should have." Jessica looked at the surgical unit doors. Her throat moved. "I didn't know," she said. "Now you do," Caleb said. He said it gently, without accusation, the way you hand someone something fragile and trust them to hold it right. Martha had her rosary out, her fingers moving through the decades in the quiet, methodical way she's done since before I knew her. I looked at the clock on the wall every 8 minutes, not because I thought it would help, but because a man who has spent 40 years measuring things in workshops finds it hard to stop measuring when he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. Caleb fell asleep in the second hour. His head tipped back against the wall, his big contractor's hands open and relaxed in his lap, and after a minute he began to snore, just barely, just enough to hear. Martha looked at him, and something shifted in her face, a softness she'd been holding back all morning. I felt something loosen in my chest, too. There is something about a man who drives through the night and shows up and falls asleep in a plastic chair that tells you everything you need to know about who he is and what he thinks of you. I have known Caleb Johnson for 30 years. I don't know that I've ever been more grateful for him than in that moment. Jessica didn't sleep. She didn't read. She didn't look at her phone. She sat with her feet flat on the floor and her hands in her lap, and she watched the surgical unit doors the entire time with the focused, unblinking attention of a person who has decided that watching is the only useful thing left to do and intends to do it without flinching. 4 hours and 35 minutes. The surgeon came through the doors, still in his scrubs. He looked at us, and I stood up, and he said the words, "Tumor removed, completely clean margins, no indication of malignancy beyond what the scans had shown. 6 to 8 weeks of recovery. He'd be sore for a while, but he would be fine." Martha turned to face the wall. She put both palms flat against it and pressed her forehead to the back of her hands. Her shoulders moved once. I put my hand between her shoulder blades and kept it there, and felt her breathe. Caleb woke, looked around, understood what the surgeon's posture meant before a word had been said, and nodded once at nobody in particular. Then he closed his eyes again for a moment, and I think he said something under his breath. I didn't ask what. Jessica sat very still for a count of 3. Then she took out her phone and dialed her mother's number in Pasadena. 3 rings, 4, voicemail. She listened to the recorded greeting, her mother's careful, composed voice, and ended the call without leaving a message. She looked at the phone for a moment, the way you look at a door that has been closed too many times to believe it will open. Then she put it in her pocket, stood up, and walked to the surgical unit doors to wait for them to let us in. I watched her go. I thought about a woman who had stood on a Pasadena front step with a bag over her shoulder and been told she'd married the wrong kind of man, who had sat on a shed floor for 15 minutes because a spiral notebook had broken something open in her that she hadn't known was sealed, who had crossed a dark yard at 9 o'clock at night and knocked on a door she had no certainty would open. I thought about rubber boots, 2 sizes too large, and a basket of eggs carried across a yard in the early morning, and the particular courage of a person who has been given every reason to protect themselves and decides at some point, and for reasons they may not be able to fully name, to stop. When they let us into the recovery room, Ethan was still coming up out of the anesthesia, eyes half open, the particular slowness of a man arriving back from somewhere a long way off. I stood at the head of the bed. He focused on me gradually, the way you focus when consciousness comes back in layers rather than all at once. He tried to say something. His mouth moved, but nothing came out except a breath. I shook my head slightly. "Rest," I said. He closed his eyes. His hand lay open on the blanket at his side. I put my hand over it, not gripping, just covering, and I stood there while the monitors beeped their steady reassurance, and the light came through the window, and Iowa City went about its Tuesday business, 4 floors below us, indifferent and ordinary, and exactly right. After a while, Jessica came and stood on the other side of the bed. She took Ethan's other hand in both of hers, and held it the way you hold something you came close to losing. Martha sat in the chair in the corner with her rosary still in her hands. Her eyes closed now, her lips moving just barely. Caleb leaned against the wall near the door with his arms folded, keeping watch, the way he'd always kept watch, from slightly back and to the side, where he could see everything and be ready if anything was needed. The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when the worst has passed. And everyone knows it, and nobody wants to be the first to say so out loud, in case saying it breaks the spell. I looked out the window at the Iowa River running through the trees below, catching the July light on its surface in long, broken pieces. I thought about the east field. I thought about a paint can sitting on a porch railing. I thought about what I would say to my son when he was awake enough to hear it. I couldn't think of any words that were large enough for what I wanted to say. So I stood there with my hand over my son's hand, and I said nothing at all, and for the first time in a very long time that felt like exactly the right thing. 6 weeks after the surgery, on a Monday morning in October, I opened the can of Curious Sky Blue. Ethan came out of the house while I was stirring it. He was moving carefully, still, the way a man moves when his body has been through something and is still in negotiations with itself about what's allowed. But he was moving. He stood on the porch and looked at the can and looked at me. "You're doing it today," he said. "You said you wanted to help," I said. He went back inside and came out with the second brush I'd left on the porch railing. He looked at the store, the gray-blue of the old coat, the crack along the bottom panel I'd filled last week, and then he dipped the brush and started on the lower half, without asking where I wanted him to start. We worked from the bottom up. It's the right way to paint a door if you don't want drips you can't catch. After a while, Ethan said, "Why blue?" I kept painting. "Martha picked it," I said. First week we moved in, 1989. We had nothing, mattress, 2 boxes, the stubbornness of people who don't know yet what they're getting into. I let that sit for a moment. Neighbor named Roy brought over a can of leftover paint from a job he'd finished. This exact color, more or less. Martha looked at it and said blue was right. "Why blue specifically?" Ethan asked. She said a blue door means the people inside are going to be okay. I dipped my brush. I've repainted it every 5 years since. Didn't matter what year it was. Ethan was quiet for a moment. His brush moved in long, even strokes. "Did you always believe that?" he asked. "That they were going to be okay?" I thought about that honestly before I answered. "No," I said. "Some years I painted it because I needed it to be true more than I believed it was." I looked at the door. "Turns out that's enough. You do the thing. The believing catches up." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something lands somewhere real. We painted in silence for a while. The October air was cold enough to see your breath in the early morning, but the sun was coming up over the tree line, and the field was amber and exact. The corn long harvested, the ground resting. It was the kind of morning Iowa does better than anywhere. Martha came to the door at some point. She opened it from the inside carefully, since we were still painting the frame, and set 2 cups of coffee on the porch railing. She looked at the door, at the new coat going on, and she put her fingertip against the fresh paint. Drew it back with a dot of blue on the tip. She looked at that for a moment, then looked at me. I looked at her. She went back inside. That was all. That was plenty. Jessica was sitting on the porch steps with her jacket on, watching. She had her knees pulled up and her coffee in both hands, and she was watching the way a person watches something they're trying to fix in memory deliberately, like they know they'll want it later. Caleb called while we were finishing the second coat. I put him on speaker because my hands were covered in paint. "How's the patient?" he said. "Painting a door," Ethan said. A pause. Then, "Tell your dad it better be blue." Ethan looked at me. I kept painting. "He heard you," Ethan said. We finished the second coat around 9. Ethan stepped back and looked at the door, the new color bright against the weathered wood of the frame, the crack filled and smooth, the brass handle catching the morning light. "Looks good, Dad," he said. I stepped back and stood beside him. The door was blue. The field behind us was amber. The sky above the tree line was the particular clear of an October morning that doesn't come around more than a few times a year and never lasts long enough. Martha was inside making something that smelled like cornbread. Jessica was still on the steps, her coffee gone, her face turned up to the sun. "Yeah," I said. "It does." I put my hand against the door. Not the handle, just the flat of my palm against the painted wood. The way you touch something you've made to see if it's solid. The paint was almost dry. Another hour and it would be set. Ethan went inside. The screen door banged softly behind him, the way it always has, the way it was doing when he was 7 years old, and running in from the field with something he'd found and couldn't wait to show me. I stood on the porch alone for a moment. There are things that don't get fixed. I know that. There is damage that paint doesn't cover. And there are words said in workshops at 11 at night that live in the body longer than they should. I am not a man who forgets easily, and forgiveness is a slower project than I once thought. And some mornings I still wake up and feel the weight of what the past 2 years cost, before I remember that the weight is different now. Not gone, but distributed differently, held by more hands than mine alone. But this morning I painted the door. And my son stood next to me and painted it with me. And Martha left a fingerprint in the fresh paint and didn't wipe it off. And Caleb called from Iowa City and said what Caleb always says when he means that things are going to be all right. Martha called from inside. "Breakfast." I put the brush across the top of the paint can and went in. The door was blue behind me. It would be blue for another 5 years. Whatever happened inside those 5 years, the door would stay blue because that's the agreement I made with Martha in 1989, and I have never once found a reason good enough to break it. I don't expect I will. I am 62 years old, and I am still learning what it means to be a father. Here is what I know now that I did not know. Then being needed is not the same as being loved. I spent 15 months confusing the two, and that confusion cost my wife her medication, cost me the land my father left me, and nearly cost my son the chance to become the man he was always capable of being. I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you because somewhere out there, someone is sitting at a kitchen table right now, doing the same math I did, crossing out the same lines, telling themselves the same story about what love requires. Family justice does not come from a courtroom. It comes from the moment you stop accepting less than the truth. Don't do what I did. Don't wait for a phone call at 11 at night to tell you what you already know. Don't let pride and silence do the work that honesty should do. I believe, and this is my own opinion, no one else's, that God puts people in your life who will tell you the hard thing if you let them. Caleb told me. Martha showed me. Ethan finally asked me. These are what I call Dad's revenge stories. Not revenge against a person, but against silence, against waiting, against the version of yourself that keeps carrying things alone. The best family justice I ever found was in a paint can and a kitchen table and a son who came home. If any part of this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. I read everyone. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more Dad's revenge stories about the quiet kind of courage, subscribe to this channel. We'll be here. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories that follow contain some fictional elements created for the purpose of reflection and encouragement. If this type of content is not for you, we respect that completely. Please feel free to find what speaks to you best.